But then my students convinced me wisely, my Swedish students, ask about other things you do with your phone to avoid people. So at least once a month, do you look at your email? Do you play a game? Do you look at television? Depending on what your phone has available. Not because you want to use that function, but you want to avoid either an acquaintance or a stranger. And the numbers rise here. So the Swedes, although they won't pretend to talk, they'll pretend to do something else in order to avoid either an acquaintance, 15% of them, or a stranger, 18% of them. The US, the numbers go up. About a quarter of the respondents said, I'll avoid an acquaintance or avoid a stranger by pretending to do something with my mobile phone that's basically text or visually based. Italy, you don't avoid acquaintances again. It's only 8%, down pretty low. But you do avoid strangers a little bit more, 13%. Interestingly, the Japanese and Korean numbers shot way up. 21% of the Japanese avoiding acquaintances, 25% of the Japanese avoiding strangers, and in Korea, 20 and 22% respectively. So there are things you can do that you're not looking obtrusive and you're not really lying on. As a matter of fact, my Swedish students, when I said, do you ever pretend to talk on your phone when you're not? They looked at me in total innocence and said, that would be lying. They also didn't understand American Facebook because we lie a lot on Facebook. Okay, the word association task. I'll go fairly quickly through the coding process. It was long and involved. It took a year to get the categories straight. But I'd like to talk about how we saw sort of the words fall out. So we asked, what are the first 3 words you think of when you think of mobile phones? And let's focus particularly on the issues linked to control. So we coded all the words, and they're all listed there. And we had the survey was done in the actual languages. We translated into Swedish, into Italian, into Korean, into Japanese. We looked at technology issues, at physical attributes, at the communication category. We'll come back to that. Positive and negative evaluations. And I'll go fairly quickly through this because we'll focus in on the words that I think are most interesting. Some cost issues, some safety issues. And in Korea, apparently, there's lots of advertising done on SMS. Overall rankings, communication was up there on top. So across all the countries, somewhere between 42 and 52% of those 3 words came out as relating in some way, shape, or form to communication. If you pull out some of the subsectors there, particularly texting and talking, you'll find that texting was something a lot of people had on their minds when they were talking about what comes to mind. So 17% of Swedes, 14% of the US, 21% of Italians, 29% of the Japanese, 25% of Koreans. How many people thought about talking? Well, the number that strikes me first is the Japanese, only 2%, whereas Americans were 11%, and they grew up using this device to talk first before texting came in. But you notice the Korean number is high because the Koreans do the most talking as well as the most texting. Positive and negative evaluations. I looked at these sort of just, find the highest numbers. So positive evaluations, the Swedes, 10% had their words having to say something nice about mobile phones. 18% of the Americans, 15% of the Italians, 18% again of the Japanese, 11% of the Koreans. And the words they tended to use that were positive, just to give you an idea, is indispensable, or die without it, or best friend, or easy, convenient. And then you go to the negative words. Things such as, so the Swedes were very polite, they weren't very negative. 4% had negative words in those first 3 word associations. 8% of the Americans, 4% of the Italians, 7%, oh, it's getting a little higher for Japan, 2% of the Koreans. What kinds of words? A lot about addiction and stress, and it's time-consuming and it's annoying. And it was astounding to see how many people really had negative feelings just in this brainstorming word association task about their mobile phones. When it came to the negative evaluations, there was an interesting difference between the United States and Japan. The Americans said it's annoying, it's bothersome. The Japanese talked a lot about addiction and dependency. Okay, what did people like most about their mobile phones? Communication. If you ask, what's the one thing you like most about your mobile phones? It's communication. And I found it fascinating that the Swedes had 77% of their responses of what they liked most was communication. But they were using their phones the least. But they had to say something, right? And they weren't using the internet much, so there wasn't much to talk about. 49% in the US, 58% of the Italians, 46% of the Japanese, 28% of the Koreans. And I think that's because they talked a lot about some of the graphic functions of what they liked most. So if there were other things to talk about, that would reduce your numbers. But communication was fairly high still for everyone. When you broke out the texting, there were a lot of people who liked most texting, in particular the Swedes, although they didn't text that much. They had resigned themselves to having to pay for talking, and they talked and texted about the same amount, unlike any of the other populations. Nobody liked most talking. Nobody mentioned it. What do you like least about your phone? Oh wait, communication. So the Swedes, 48%, the Americans, 49%, the Italians, 44%, the Japanese, 27%, because there were a lot of other things they didn't like, and the Koreans, 42%. They didn't like having to answer people. Okay, the subcategories, there were some people who complained about texting. Particularly interesting is the Japanese complaining about texting, which doesn't surprise me. There were 5% of people who liked least texting. Why? Because on a Keitai, texting is very complicated compared with an alphabetic system in particular. Then there were these other categories of dependency. You'll see the Koreans. 31% of the Koreans said what I like least is being dependent, basically meaning I'm always having to be around. When it came to the question of, am I obligated to respond? And some people specifically said, I have to respond, I don't always want to. 11% of the Swedes said that's what they liked least about their phones. 9% of the Americans. The Italians, I guess, think they should respond, so only 4% complained about that, only 4% of the Japanese. A lot of complaint about equipment. 20% of the complaints from the Japanese were about equipment or transmission issues, which may be one reason their communication score for what they liked least was low, because they were busy complaining about the equipment and the translation. And then a lot of complaints from the Japanese about cost. Okay, just a few examples of this obligation to respond in terms of what people like least. A Swedish female. What do I like least? That other people know I can always be reached. So you can never say you can't take the call, because everyone knows you can see missed calls. You didn't used to be able to see missed calls in the United States. I learned about missed calls when I was in Europe, and then they came to the United States. An Italian female. That others can control you and believe you must always be accessible. An American male. No excuse for not talking to people that I don't want to talk to. Or my all-time favorite from an Italian male. To be always retraceable, so much so that at home I put my mobile phone in a lead box to avoid being traced, so it doesn't give a signal that it's off, but not reachable. Okay, so we rescored the data a little bit in terms of this notion of reachability, which heavily involved communication, but a few other scores as well. It's basically included I could reach you, you could reach me, or sometimes they just would say things like reachable, so you didn't know what the directionality was. What did people like most about their phone? If you took all their answers, somewhere between 65 and 88% said, I like most that there's this reachability factor, and it was heavily I can reach other people. But then somewhere between 37% and 72%, if you're from Korea, said what I like least is reachability. So there's this real love-hate relationship, I think, that's going on with mobile phones that we don't talk a lot about. We sell them, we use them, we chronicle what people are doing with them. But the question that I think is important to get to is, what do we think about what we're doing? Do we like it?